Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rob Hogg. I am a member of Christ Episcopal Church in Cedar Rapids and the board chair of Iowa Interfaith Power and Light. And we are so grateful for your participation today in this webinar. I just want to frame the issue that's before us and the afternoon that's before us just very briefly, because like many of you, I feel the heartache and the trauma when I see the disaster damage that is affecting our fellow people and our fellow citizens in the southeast of the United States from Hurricane Helene. In Iowa, we are familiar with climate-related disasters, the floods of 2008, 2010, and 2011, and 2016, and 2019, and then again this year. The derecho of 2020 that caused so much damage to people across our state, including me at my home in Cedar Rapids. The drought of 2020 through 2024 that was gone and is back again as in Cedar Rapids, we have had only 5/100ths of an inch of measurable precipitation since August 30th and had the longest dry spell in the history of record keeping at the Cedar Rapids National Weather Service. And of course, it's not just Iowa. We know it's across the country. The terrible wildfires that destroyed Paradise, California, and the Lahaina in Maui. And of course, the repeat hurricanes that have done so much damage from Harvey and Maria to Ida to Ian to Idalia to Irma to Michael to Florence to Laura to Matthew to Beryl and Helene. And now we're praying for the people in Florida as they face Hurricane Milton. It seems overwhelming at times, and quite honestly, it is. But we also know that we're called to take action. 25 years ago, I remember reading in the Hebrew scriptures in Genesis, reading again the story of Joseph in Egypt. And I was struck by how Joseph, with God's help, was able to take action to save the people of Egypt and save the people of Israel by storing up food during the good years so they had enough to survive the bad years. And that was 25 years ago, and I told people then that we were, like Joseph in Egypt, we were called to take effective precautionary action against climate change. Well, now 25 years later, we still are called to do that at the same time that we're dealing with the consequences of a climate crisis. And I truly believe that people of faith can take action, can be leaders, can take care of our neighbors, to take care of people around the world, and to take care of the environment, which all of us across all of our faith traditions believe is sacred and worthy of protection. So it is my hope that today we can get some tangible ideas and do some listening and some learning and feel inspiration to take action. And so it's my honor to turn it over to our next speaker. And as Tim said, in the interest of time, the biographical materials are available in the downloads. So we're going to jump straight into each presentation with hopefully minimal introduction. And after each presentation, take a moment during which time you can make notes, take a stretch, get refreshed, and get ready for the next presentation. We are here live at the Unitarian Universalist Society in Coralville, Iowa, which is considered the greenest church in our state. And our next speaker, the Reverend Diana Smith, is the minister here, and she'll be speaking about creating and recreating the greenest church in Iowa. Diana.
Thanks, Rob. So our new building where I'm sitting today, which is the physical site of the greenest church in Iowa, opened in October of 2017. I began serving here in August 2020 during the pandemic, and after the building had been open for almost 3 years. So in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about what it's like operating the greenest church in Iowa. But first, I wanted to share with you all a little bit about how we got here. This story is important because, as all of us in congregations know, change doesn't happen quickly. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to be paying attention to as we think about and how we build capacity as we work on greening our congregations. So, in fact, our journey with this congregation to this current building took several decades and involved a lot of division, as well as a lot of visioning and joy. So here's a little bit of history for you. So first, the Unitarian Universalist Society of Iowa City began in 1841, meeting in downtown Iowa. Now, while Unitarians and Universalists didn't officially merge to create our current denomination until 1961, here they merged in the 1870s when the Universalists agreed to provide a building if the Unitarians provided a preacher. And so, in 1908, the congregation moved into a new building in the middle of downtown Iowa City, where the congregation would stay for over a century. Now, by the 1990s, that building, which was almost 100 years old, was becoming clear that it was no longer serving the congregation's needs. The main problems were accessibility, space for large gatherings, the energy use of that old building, and environmental unsustainability. So then, for about 20 years, various groups were formed to try to find solutions, most of them involving remodeling the building. However, each time the emotional attachment that members had to our old building won out and plans were voted down. And so the divisions and frustration with stagnation deepened. So this might sound, fairly familiar to some of you and like a rather ominous beginning for this story. But there's a second piece of this, which is that respect for the interdependent web of life is one of our key principles as Unitarian Universalists. As well, we also hold as some of our key principles justice and transformation, and we are united by covenant. So, in 2008, this congregation's Green Sanctuary team began educating the congregation about the importance of living sustainably, environmental justice, and caring for our planet. This capacity building that the Green Sanctuary team did laid a foundation for deeper and more widespread congregational inclusion of and advocacy for sustainability. And I think this is a really key piece of the story, that this capacity building, this education work began in 2008. So then, in 2012, when the congregation developed a new mission and vision, as well as a new strategic plan, this congregation set environmental justice as one of the key missions for this congregation. That, combined with a large financial gift that was contingent on the congregation making some decision related to remodeling or building something new, any decision, but just a decision, that laid the foundation for a process that led to the building that we're in right now. The congregation worked hard on understanding and coming to agreement about their priorities, which did include remaining in downtown Iowa City, having the capacity to meet as a whole congregation at one time, being exceptionally accessible, and being exceptionally green or sustainable. The congregation had decided that they truly wanted to be able to claim being the greenest church in Iowa, not just in principle, but in how we were living our lives as a congregation. Now, as many of us know, redevelopment or remodeling is often a much more sustainable choice than building new construction. And the congregation worked really hard on identifying options that would allow them to either remodel the old building or redevelop another site downtown. However, we were unable to find a workable and affordable path. And then in 2015, the 5.5-acre Miller farm, where we are now, came up for sale. While a developer was also interested, the owners were really pleased that the congregation would leave much of the land in its natural state, preserving its nature reserve qualities. And so the congregation was able to purchase this site. While this was a major step, additional major steps had to be completed, including financing and design. Now, I'm not going to go into those in great detail here because that's not the focus of this talk, but I will share that the financial part of developing and operating a new large building shouldn't be underestimated, particularly in our current climate for religious institutions. This congregation is vibrant and growing coming out of the pandemic and still figuring out how to develop partnerships that help us make better use of our building while also making ends meet financially is an ongoing process. And it's one that can be quite generative and beautiful, and it does take ongoing investment from me as well as other congregational leaders. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit about our building and then get more into some of the things that have gone into recreating, continuously recreating this as the greenest church in Iowa. Now, I'm excited that those of you who are here in person are going to be able to tour the building and grounds after our discussions. For those of you who are online, I have added a few pictures that don't quite do this building, this place justice, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor as I talk about this. So one of the things that I noticed from the first time I entered this space, and that many newcomers share with me, is how much it integrates with the natural world and feels like a space of welcoming and healing. This is a result of careful planning and design, and also of how we live and work in this space. Environmental sustainability and biophilia have been key aspects of how the Greenest Church was created, as well as how we live in it. And I'm going to get back to this principle of biophilia shortly if you haven't heard of that before. Before and during construction, several gatherings and rituals were held on the land, and the groundbreaking ceremony was held on Earth Day of 2016. Construction took about 18 months. This principle of biophilia was emphasized to help this be a space of healing, to help us reconnect with the natural world, both to heal our minds and our hearts, and to help us feel our natural reverence for Earth and our connection with our desire to protect and heal the Earth. One of the most visible ways this shows up when you arrive is how the building blends in with the natural world, especially through the landscaping and solar panels, as well as through its simple design. And there you can see it at night. Once inside the building, people immediately notice all the windows, which you're getting a view of from that picture, which connect us immediately and intimately with the natural world. Natural daylight and views from within almost every single space in this building connect us directly with the earth. During worship services on Sunday mornings, when I'm preaching from the very far corner of that image, we often get to watch deer, turkeys, a woodchuck, hawks, or other birds, as well as how the grasses and the trees change with the seasons. People may also notice the sustainably sourced furnishings and fixtures. Through a life cycle analysis, materials were carefully selected for their low environmental and human health impacts. This was based on the idea that buildings are made for people and they should be healthy for us. Additional biophilic strategies that were incorporated in the building design included visual connection with nature, dynamic and diffuse light, connection with natural systems, biomorphic patterns and forms through things like the carpet pattern and our use of natural colors, our use of natural materials, and the use of complexity and order through things like the rhythm of our structural bays and our curves. A few other things about this building. All of our energy is produced on site. This is a net zero building, meaning we actually produce more energy than we use in this building. That energy comes from solar panels as well as geothermal. We have 10 heat pumps for heating and cooling, which is supplemented by our solar energy system. We use LED lighting, low water use plumbing, basically things that reduce resource use. This is a single level building for accessibility. We currently have 4 charging stations for electric vehicles in our parking lot. And we limited our parking lot to 75 spaces, and we encourage walking, bicycling, carpooling, or using other parking lots for people who are coming to services, because 75 spaces is a lot more people than we have. We have bioretention cells for stormwater. Those are planted with native grasses, shrubs, and pollinators. We have a nature playscape, which you'll see in a little while. Ren, you're doing great with going through these slides. So we have a nature, and then outdoors, we have a nature playscape. We have a labyrinth for meditation. We have a memorial garden. We have community vegetable gardens, some of which you saw at the very beginning. And we have trails through our 10 acres of woodland property. And we really focus on living with wildlife on the land and creating this as a space that really is restorative. In this picture, you can see our building with all of the different solar panels. You can also see the housing complex that we're right next to. This was taken right after the building was created, so the bioswales haven't really been planted yet in this one, and things have grown up a little bit since then, but it gives you an idea of what it's like here. The indoor spaces here offer amazing opportunities for healing and connection with nature while reducing our environmental impact. And this is especially true because of the biophilic principles used, as well as the attention that we've paid to sustainable operations. And here I want to talk a little bit about how our spaces can be places of healing, beauty, and learning. So one of the plans from the beginning of this building was to intentionally use our outdoor spaces for programming to further our connection with Earth. We knew that while we had created a beautiful building, there's nothing that compares to actually being out in it. And so while there was that intention, which was followed to some extent, it's my understanding from talking with members that um, that our use of the outdoors was actually fairly limited for the first 2.5 years before the pandemic shut down the building to in-person gatherings. The in-person spaces were so wonderful that it was easy to default to using them. But the pandemic forced us to move into more creative uses of outdoor spaces for gatherings and rituals. Now, while we've moved back from that somewhat, now that we can also gather indoors, we've learned much more about how we can use our trails for special celebrations and our patios for some worship services, as well as how we can use the landscape for much more extensively for lifespan religious education programming, some of which you're seeing there. We also practice we have earth-centered worship and celebration. This includes everything from weaving themes, environmental themes, into worship services, using natural objects during various regular and special rituals in the sanctuary, inviting people to connect with what's happening in the natural world and how it affects us, to special celebrations on the land. In fact, I was just talking with somebody before this started who had only been here before for wintertime solstice celebrations and had just had a chance to walk the trails in daylight and warmth and was really appreciating that. We do a lot of nature-based religious education throughout the year and during summer camps. And we involve the entire congregation in stewarding or caring for the land that we've been entrusted with. We also have things, programming like an upcoming climate justice revival that we're doing that help us work on enhancing our ability to do community organizing. And we work on cultivating wonder, deepening our motivation, and promoting healing. Our Green Sanctuary team, which is made up of volunteer members of a congregation, and our staff work together to lead all of these efforts that relate to our operations. And currently we're working on what we call our Green Sanctuary reaccreditation. Green Sanctuary is a program of the Unitarian Universalist Association. The Green Sanctuary reaccreditation is asking us to look for opportunities and challenges in 4 areas. Those are congregational transformation, mitigating climate change, adapting and building resilience to the effects of climate change, securing justice for marginalized communities most impacted but least responsible for climate change. As a result of our reaccreditation process, we're working to continue and extend programming by creating a climate resiliency hub here. That'll include adding battery storage to our solar power system to cover critical loads for 8 to 12 hours, and which with solar recharging could cover needs indefinitely. So we can become a resource for the wider neighborhood, which includes a child care center, a long-term care facility, and at least 100 households. And a resiliency hub is also a way for us to connect with and educate and engage our neighbors. We'll also be adding 4 more EV charging stations in our parking lot. While we've had special opportunities here because of our new building, there are lessons from what we've done here that I think all congregations can apply. These includes things like enhancing our connections with Earth through how we use our building, through how our buildings function. That can include how we make use of our sight lines, the materials we use, and that kind of thing. Basically bringing the principles of biophilia into whatever our buildings are like right now. We can get outdoors for programming whenever we can, especially for lifespan religious education programming. We can call attention to what's happening in the natural world and how we're interconnected. In worship, this can be as simple as noticing what's happening with the natural cycles or the weather, using natural objects and rituals or interactive moments. I think here about the difference between a natural rock and a glass pebble, or a natural leaf and a construction paper one. We can build in rituals that connect us with the changing seasons. We can also create opportunities for our congregations to work together on earth healing projects. We can work on infrastructure improvements, which you're going to hear more about as well. We can use environmentally minded purchasing. This is an ongoing thing for us. And it is complicated, isn't it? Developing a green sanctuary team is amazing. And finally, I just want to leave you with the thought about developing capacity. Going back to where this story started for us, it began with the Green Sanctuary team working on congregational education and engagement. In the language of faith-based community organizing, they developed the relationships and the capacity that allowed this congregation to mobilize for change when the opportunity presented itself to us. And that continues now through things like our climate justice revival, which uses a faith-based community organizing model. So those are just a few thoughts from me about what it's been like to be part of creating and recreating this greenest church in Iowa, and more people will take it from there. Thanks for listening. At this point, maybe turn to your neighbor and chat or jot down a few thoughts. Were there things that you heard here that feels particularly important or useful? And is there something you want to do in response to that? You have a minute and then someone else will talk.
Thanks again to Reverend Diana and everyone else for attending today's Climate Informed Ministry webinar. I'm Ren Matson. I'm the Program Associate with Iowa Interfaith Power and Light, running the slides today. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, Karla Stolzfus Detweiler. And she will be talking about deepening the language of faith in a climate-changed world. And with that, I will pass it to you, Karla.
Thanks, Ren. Okay, I seem to be having my computer is not wanting me to share my slides. So I think I will just have to speak to you with my words without images, but we can do that. So good afternoon. It is wonderful to be with you all today. I am Karla Stolzfus Detweiler. I serve as Climate Justice Coordinator for Mennonite Church USA. And in that role, I seek to resource churches practically and theologically as we follow Jesus in a climate-changed world. And I really feel that the practical and theological aspects of this work go hand in hand. When we're addressing climate change, I think our ultimate goal is practical. We want people to change how we live, to shift away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy, shift our transportation habits, change the way we manage land, etc. But I am convinced that to motivate and sustain those practical changes, we must attend to our spirits and to our theological foundations. And I happen to love the theological stuff, so that's what I'm going to focus on today. Faith leaders who preach and teach have a beautiful opportunity to draw connections between our sacred stories and our current situation of climate crisis. We have the opportunity to open conversations about climate change using the language of faith. And so I want to lift up some of this language of faith that I think can help us do that. Now, want to also acknowledge that sometimes pastors and church leaders are afraid to open conversations about climate change because it is such a politically polarizing topic. And I get that. I have felt some reluctance in my role sometimes when going into some churches where I am sure there are a variety of perspectives on climate. But in my experience, congregations that have avoided the topic of climate are glad to break the silence. People from all along the theological, political spectrum long for an opportunity to connect climate and faith. Just to share an example from one congregation where I preached and led a Christian education time. Afterwards, a mother of a young adult woman came to me with tears in her eyes and thanked me. She said, "My daughter is so anxious about climate change that she is choosing not to have children." And that clearly was tugging on this mother's heart. She was so grateful that her congregation was making space to talk about something that was affecting her and her family so personally. In the same congregation, a farmer came up to me afterwards and said, "Well, I guess I'm what you'd call a denier." And then he wanted to engage with me at length, talking about his observations of weather patterns and telling me about the many hundreds of trees he's planted on his land. And I would venture that many congregations have participants who resonate with the tearful mother and with the climate change denying tree planting farmer. Faith communities have an opportunity to overcome that fear of the topic and invite their members to bring their deeply held questions and concerns to the light and let faith be a guide and resource in the midst of fear and questions. So I'm going to lift up 4 words of faith that I believe we can offer as a resource to our communities of faith in our climate changed world. The first word I want to lift up is a Hebrew word, the word shalom, which is often translated as peace. And the Hebrew prophets use the word shalom to describe Yahweh's vision of peace for the whole world. Shalom is wholeness, harmony, well-being, not just of relationships between people, but for the relationships between people and all of creation and people in relationship with Creator God. Shalom is a vision of an abundant earth where no one, human or animal, goes hungry. And it's a world where we all trust Creator God for enough. My tradition, the Mennonite tradition, highly values peace. Peace is a central value. And I think that's a value that many of our faith communities hold in common. In our climate changed world, we can deepen our understanding of God's peace by exploring this vision of shalom. And we can preach from the prophets to make parallels to today, and we can invite congregations to study and practice shalom. In our climate change world, I think this word shalom can become our compass, offering the hope of restoration for all people and all of creation. The second word I would like to lift up is lament. And so the next 3 words I'm offering come from my study of the prophet Joel in the Hebrew scriptures. And from that book, especially chapters 1 and 2 of Joel. And a little bit of background here about the book of Joel and what that book, the story it tells. The book of Joel tells of an ecological disaster for the people of Israel. There has been a plague of locusts, or maybe multiple consecutive plagues of locusts that had eaten up the crops, devastated the economy, and dried up the joy of the people of Israel. And Joel speaks into this situation of great loss and suffering, offering a path of healing. And the first thing that Joel does is invite the community to lament. Joel names the devastation, and he recognizes that the land is grieving. The land mourns, and he calls the whole community, young and old, to join the earth in lament. So when disasters like Hurricane Helene make the headlines, or when our own neighbors are suffering the devastations that Rob talked about, tornadoes, derechos, floods, drought, a faith-filled response begins with lament. Lament helps to facilitate healing and action. We need to take time to pause, name the devastation we have witnessed out loud and in community. The invitation of lament is to be real. We don't gloss over the pain and uncertainties of a changing climate, but make space for people to express their feelings and to grieve together. The second word that I want to lift up from Joel is repent. Joel invites people to move from lament to repentance. The word repent means to turn around. It's an invitation to change our attitudes and behaviors. And this word can feel kind of fraught with connotations of guilt and shame. But what I love that the prophet Joel does is to not make a list of the people's sins connected to their ecological disaster. Instead, he focuses on the character of God. Turn toward God, Joel says, and you will find that God, like a mother bending to comfort a hurting child, is full of compassion, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. While some measure of guilt can be motivating, persistent guilt and shame can lead to inaction. So when we invite people to repentance, faith communities can help lift the burdens of guilt and shame that stymie action and offer the powerful, surprising gift of grace. When we turn around, when we repent, we'll discover that God is not angry with us. God is ready to embrace us, to cry with us, and to empower us to make changes that will bring healing for ourselves and our planet. And the last word that I'd like to commend to you in this language of faith and climate is celebrate. In the book of Joel, while the land is still devastated from the locusts, Joel cries out, "Forget your fear, my beloved land. Rejoice and be glad, for Yahweh has done great things." Joel is inviting his community to remember how God has healed them and their land before, and to trust that that can happen again. And he has this beautiful description of this cascade of healing and joy that unfolds as the land recovers, orchards and vineyards become fruitful again, and the people eat their fill and are satisfied. This same pattern of resilience, or another theological term that I love to use here is resurrection. These patterns of resurrection are at play in our earth now, even in this time of climate change. And to sustain the work of seeking healing for our climate, communities of faith must celebrate the signs of resilience that we witness. So we can lift up stories of healing and climate action in our sermons, telling the stories like Diana has done so lovely this morning, of the stories of solar installations and wetland or prairie restorations, or the resurgence of native species like Iowa's trumpeter swan or the river otter. There's some wonderful stories to tell to celebrate the healing of our land and our climate. We can also celebrate by making a big deal of the steps our congregations and neighborhoods take toward a more just and verdant world. We can have refreshments to celebrate when we do something like my church just did recently and put in energy saving windows. We can host a neighborhood party to celebrate when we install electric vehicle charging stations. We can invite the community to bring seeds and bless them, maybe have a plant swap to celebrate gardens and growing food in the spring. Or we can hold worship services outdoors to simply celebrate the beauty of creation. I am convinced that celebrating is not frivolous. It is an essential spiritual practice. And we need to do it often and lavishly to sustain our spirits as we seek healing for our climate. Faith communities have an essential role in our climate changed world, and my hope and prayer for all of you today in your communities and congregations is that you can pursue shalom with vigor, make space for lament, invite repentance and grace, and celebrate the signs of resurrection that you see each step of the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karla. Similar to what we did after Diana's presentation, please feel free to connect and reflect, turn to a neighbor and chat or jot down a few thoughts. What did you hear that feels especially important or useful? What's something you want to do in response? Thank you so much, Karla. Similar to what we did after Diana's presentation, please feel free to connect and reflect, turn to a neighbor and chat or jot down a few thoughts. What did you hear that feels especially important or useful? What's something you want to do in response? Thank you, everybody. With that, I would like to pass it off to our next panelist, Karin Stein, who is the Iowa organizer with Moms Clean Air Force. She will be speaking about the effects of climate change on children and Latinos.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ren. First of all, a little bit about Moms Clean Air Force. We are an organization of about 1.5 million members around the country. We have state coordinators like myself in about half of the states in the United States. The other half have volunteer coordinators. Our mission is to protect children from air pollution and climate change and to fight for environmental justice. And we do so with community outreach to a large degree, but primarily through work directly with members of Congress at the federal level and at the state level. In some cases, coordinators like myself are much more federally oriented. In other states where there are lots of oil and gas operations, you will find that the state coordinators are also much more heavily engaged in their local governments. And then the second branch with which we work a lot at the federal level is the Environmental Protection Agency. We are in constant contact with the Environmental Protection Agency about certain issues that come up. proposals, concerns. We routinely invite community members to give short 2-3 minute testimonies at hearings that are relevant to our work at the EPA, and we help community members express their concerns even if they've never spoken in front of, on a camera at a panel. So that's at the national level, which is my main focus. I'm also on the team of Ecomadres. I'm one of 6 fully bilingual members of Ecomadres, of Moms Clean Air Force. I'm not a US citizen. I'm a citizen of the country of Colombia. I don't vote in the US, I vote in Colombia, and I state that over and over because people, of course, look at me and listen to me and they forget that I'm a Latina. But I should mention, Karla, that your and my ancestry has something in common. My great-great-grandfather was Mennonite, and they were located in Denmark and moved their way down to northern Germany. And then about 100 years ago, my grandfather ended up in South America. My family has always been farm folk. So in South America and Colombia, I grew up in a far eastern area in the savannas. Then we moved to Costa Rica in 1974, which is my second home. And there we continued farming in a very different ecosystem, no longer savannas that are exposed to 2 extreme seasons, dry and rainy, but now in Costa Rica in a rainforest area that has more steady rain, supposedly, all year round. All of this is changing. And for the last 40 years, I have been living in rural Iowa. And I mention all of this because as a farm girl, youth, and woman who has lived in 3 parts of the Americas throughout her life, the just living in rural America, and when I use the term America, I mean all of it, North, Central, South, you really see how climate change works, and you see the changes. And if you're old like I, or older like I am, 62, you've really had a chance to compare. Anyhow, that is a background about Moms Clean Air Force and myself. I don't belong to a church. I was brought up as a child in a Protestant Lutheran, more or less that context, but we were living in the country. So there was never church. There was no electricity. There was nothing. There was no town nearby. And then I'm married to a cultural Jew. He does not go to church, to temple. So our religious background is pretty much a very generalist background. We're very respectful of religions. I think religion play a profoundly important role in encouraging people to act. And as I hear you speak, I hear you reflect that. I also believe that my sense of spirituality comes directly from nature, and that doesn't negate any of what we're talking about here today, and it connects us in various ways. But my sense of connection with nature, again, comes from rural settings where I see people work the land, where I see people be exposed to the elements. And that, to a large degree, means Latinos in all of the places that I have lived, Central, South, and the United States. And that's one thing I'd like to pivot to in the second part of what I would like to talk about. The first part is children. I think we all agree that we're concerned about our children. I have 3 adult daughters who've decided not to have children, not only because of climate change concerns. They just feel generally that the world is a mess and that their constant level of stress does not temperamentally allow them to be the parents that maybe I was still enjoying the luxury to be. So the impact on youth is very, very strong of everything relating to climate change and cultural and governmental action or inaction. So that is a broad spectrum. But let's focus on children specifically. A lot of people think of children as miniature adults, and that's just not the case. Children biologically are very different from adults. So everything that affects adults affects children in a different way, and typically in a much more intense way. And this begins before the child is even born. So the effects of climate begin in utero. The effects of extreme heat often is correlated with higher levels of air pollution, and that has to do with various elements of physics, with also where people live. Typically, I hear us speak, and it just feels so incredibly privileged that we can have a church that consciously builds green and nature into our process of reflection. Well, a lot of children, before they're even born, already live in heat deserts, in cities, in city areas that are full of cement, that sometimes have average temperatures that are 22 degrees higher in average than rural areas around a given city. So this kind of environment affects the fetus with lower birth weight, in many cases preterm birth, and improper immune system development. So from the moment this child is born, if the child isn't lost through how do you say this in English? When a pregnancy is lost, sometimes I forget, but you know what I mean. What was that? Did somebody suggest the word? Okay, well, it'll come to me. So sometimes there is a pregnancy loss early on from extreme heat, but if a child makes it to term, if the child is lucky to make it to term, if the mother has already been carrying that child under extreme heat conditions, that child is very likely to have immunological problems, lower cognitive functioning, and long-term health impacts such as asthma. So imagine at what disadvantage this child is brought to the world from before the child is even born. And then as the child develops, children up to a certain age breathe a lot faster than adults. They pound for pound, a child eats, drinks, and breathes much more than adults. So again, we're burdening children just because of how their metabolism works, doubly, triply with whatever we're burdening ourselves and others through inaction and through what we have managed to create in our world. And normal biological processes may be disrupted through chemicals that build up, especially in the heat. Brains are affected, reproductive systems are affected after birth as well. And babies and children, as I mentioned, breathe faster than adults. Think about this. Children breathe about 40 times per minute, and adults breathe about 12 to 20 times per minute. So if they're playing outside, they're inhaling heat a lot faster than adults. Their thermoregulatory system is not well developed. We know that children often get so distracted with what they're doing, they're not paying attention to how they're feeling, and they often aren't trained yet in identifying physical signals. So what hurts us as adults, in terms of heat stroke, in terms of just dangerously high temperatures that start hurting our inner organs, those things can happen extremely suddenly and quickly with children and lead to life-threatening situations. So I think it's very, very important to keep in mind that children are not miniature adults, and measures that are meant to protect adults, we need to be doubly aware of whether those measures are sufficient for children who have been born and for fetuses who are still being carried. And I mentioned heat islands in cities. This is often people who cannot afford living in housing with greener, more open areas, often are also by default exposed to heavier traffic. They're inhaling particle pollution. This particle pollution is 30 times thinner than the diameter of our human hair. It can't be seen. It gets inhaled. It goes through the placental barrier. And so now they're also not just overheated in the womb, their bloodstream is being contaminated with fossil fuels particles that are so small that they're now doubly damaged, their internal organs. Oftentimes also, these pregnant people carrying babies under very extreme conditions don't have the money to pay for air conditioning. Maybe many times, if we're talking to Latinos, and I'll pivot to that in a moment, they don't even have health insurance. They don't know where to turn if there's something wrong with their pregnancy. They just kind of say, well, don't move and hope for the best, but they don't know how to reach out to healthcare systems, or they're afraid, depending on what their immigration status is. So the inability to cool off at night is really critical, both for children as it is for fetuses, for the mother's ability to cool off at night while she's carrying the fetus. Allergens are increasing because of increasing heat. And since we're already bringing to this world children with the effect of health issues stacked against them since before they're born, now they're also exposed to more allergen, and many of them are already born with weakened lungs. And then I know somebody else is going to talk about mental health impacts after me, and I'll wait to maybe make comments or raise questions, but the mental health impacts of extreme heat are numerous and extreme in themselves, in and of themselves. It impacts how children learn. So if children from lower income communities are already disadvantaged by so many circumstances, now they go to school, the school doesn't have money to cool the school properly. Now they're having lower test scores because they can hardly focus on what they're learning, on what they're doing. They can't sleep at night. They arrive at school tired. So it just the domino effect gets building and building, starts building and building. That specifically as far as children. And now I'd like to pivot briefly to Latino workers, which there's about 60 million Hispanics. And when I say Hispanics, I mean all the identities. I'm a Latina. I'm also Hispanic. A lot of Latinos do not consider themselves Hispanic, and it gets complicated. So any identity of Latinos, and we're very multifaceted, we're very diverse culturally, linguistically. In total, there are about 60 million of us. That's about 18% of the population. And of those, about 3 million are farm workers. And then add to that outdoor workers. When you drive around in Iowa, a lot of the people working outdoors in the extreme heat are Latinos. In some areas of this country, a lot of them are women, and a lot of them are pregnant women. And remember what I just said about extreme heat and the effect on fetuses. But what's really astonishing is that about 500,000 children, Latino children, are outdoor workers. They might be forced to work after school on weekends. Sometimes they skip school because something needs to be finished on the land. So think about that and what the effect is. And Latinos are, as outdoor workers, any outdoor worker of any cultural or ethnic background is 35 times more likely to die because of heat than anybody else in this country. 35 times more likely to die from heat alone. And that is simply because biologically, humans are not built to deal with temperature extremes. We do not do well. Literally, our inner organs start to degenerate, fall apart in the heat. And so this extreme heat among Latinos and other outdoor workers is not only physically dangerous, but if the employer is conscientious enough to give the outdoor workers enough resting periods, enough recovery periods, provide the gear that they need, the water and other water, ideally also with electrolytes. I mean, let's just assume ideal working conditions, and unfortunately a lot of employers do not take the physical needs of their outdoor workers into account. The body, as it gets overexerted from heat, leads to missed work days. So now we're domino affecting into loss of income. And that may put more pressure on people to work past their safety point, for them to ignore how their bodies are feeling, and for them to put themselves into a life or death situation. And again, this can include child farm workers. I talked about the urban heat islands. A lot of outdoor workers, they're done from their exhausting work, and then they go home and they work in an urban heat island, and they may not have enough money to cool down. And that then leads to the healthcare issues that I already mentioned. So all of this is linked. I want to go back to something that my two brilliant predecessors on this panel have said. Green spaces and healing, again, the privilege of having that, and how we can use that to spread healing to community members if we have that privilege. You know, can we find out who doesn't have that privilege and reach out to them? And I know that your churches are very cognizant and aware of that sort of thing. I loved this idea of rituals and celebrations in the natural space, and then also the idea, Karla's idea of celebration being essential for the sustaining spirit. I'd like to conclude by saying one thing about Latinos that is very interesting to me, because I'm a professional musician. I have several ensembles, and we all play Latin music of various genres, various types. And recently, and just 3 years ago, Moms Clean Air Force supported me in creating a music group called Son Tierra. We sing mostly in Spanish, but not exclusively, and we perform many different styles of Latin music. We're primarily Iowa-based. We're all Latino. We have 6 different, sometimes 7 different nationalities represented. And one of the reasons Moms Clean Air Force supported me in creating this group, the songs we perform, or the songs that I write for the group, have to do with the topics that we work on. So clean air, climate action, taking action, reaching for hope, finding strength, finding hope, reaching out to Congress even. I even wrote a song about electric school buses. Why did I do this? Because I recognized the need for celebration. A lot of people think, if we just put things in Spanish, por ejemplo, voy a hablar español por un momentito. Yo les podría estar diciendo en este momento que hay un peligro enorme, que en este momento, en 3 minutos, va a golpear la casa y que hay que salir corriendo, y ustedes no tienen ni idea de lo que dije. So, language translation is important. I just said, what would you do? I don't know how many of you understood, but I said, what would you do if I had just told you that there's something about to hit the house and that you have 30 seconds to get out, but you didn't understand it? So clearly, language barriers are important, but it's not just language. It's not just about translating the fact sheets of what heat does to Latino workers and to children. Every culture and their circumstances is here in a unique way. A lot of Latinos here don't have the cultural background, the cultural tradition, and the education and the time of day to concern themselves with finding out why 98% of the plastic bottles that they drink, because they think buying water in the supermarket is safer than drinking it from the faucet, a cultural legacy. They don't have the time to figure out why only 2% of that plastic gets recycled and the other 98% end up in making the environment worse. It's not enough to translate fact sheets. We have to reach them culturally and connect. And that is why that piece of celebration is so important. Moms Clean Air Force understood that for us in Latin America, music is a very important language. I'm not going to presume that most of the people that are listening to us while we play this music are even thinking about the words we're singing. But they're connecting with us through the musical language. And then we can reach them, sit down, and talk about the issues we just sang about. But first we have to connect through joy. First we have to connect through a cultural language. And I really appreciate both of you to address this very, very important source of connection and strength. and the power of using our space to create health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karin. Again, we will be connecting and reflecting, so feel free to chat with your neighbors or jot down any thoughts, feelings, things you found important or useful, and things you want to do to respond. I would like to introduce our next panelist, Robert Treyer. His presentation is entitled, "What is Our Duty to Future Generations?" Robert, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Ren, did you get my chat note to be prepared to show 2 slides?
Yes, just let me know whenever you want me to put them
All
up.
right. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. I'd like the second one first, but I'll tell you when. The question on the screen you're seeing is one I've used many times in ethical classes that I've taught over the years, especially, of course, when I was teaching environmental ethics, and that was the crux of the issue. It raises a very difficult question, but it requires context to answer in any meaningful way. So I'm going to talk about answering this question in the context of being residents of Iowa and its land, and what it was, what it is, and what we should be trying to pass on to future generations. Life on Earth has been evolving on the planet for 4 billion years. Sunlight, water, and soil have enabled microorganisms, plants, and fungi to sustain the varied ecosystems in which wild animals have thrived. After the last ice age ended 10,000 years ago in this part of the planet, the land we know as Iowa evolved as a prairie, with perennial grasses and flowers storing carbon in deep roots, and through photosynthesis providing the oxygen that made animal life possible. The Smithsonian Magazine confirms that as recent as the 19th century, 30 to 60 million buffalo lived sustainably on the plains with Native Americans until settlers and soldiers slaughtered the herds of buffalo to destroy the food supply that Native Americans relied on to survive. Only 200 years later in Iowa now, the land is dominated in a very different way, unsustainably, by concentrated animal feeding operations, raising 25 million hogs, 55 million chickens, and 3 million cattle annually. And now, Ren, if you would show that second slide. Much of the corn and soybeans grown in monocultures is used to feed confined livestock and poultry. but the manure from these CAFOs and the excessive fertilizer spread to try to increase crop yields on the corn and soybeans being grown to feed them, runs off, pollutes the Iowa rivers and lakes, and ends up down the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico, increasing the expanding dead zone. How are we to respond to harsh facts such as these? I don't see on my screen that slide, but if you can show it, that would be nice. We think now in this context that we are, yes, there it is. In this slide, we see the incredible fact, only a result of the last 20 years, really, of the concentration of hogs in Iowa. And with this many hogs, the ratio of human manure and hogs is unbelievably high. And this is our environment, and this is a polluting environment in a whole variety of ways for everyone and all animals and creatures living in this environment in Iowa. So what is our duty to future generations of plants and animals, as well as humans, in Iowa? For example, if you agree that if we held a picnic together in a park, that we should pick up afterwards and make sure there's no refuse around or garbage, that the park basically should be left as we found it, so someone else can live in it and enjoy it as we did. Well, can that be applied to our lives in Iowa? Might we agree that Iowans should leave the land in as good a condition as it was before settlers and soldiers forced Native Americans from the land where they had lived sustainably for centuries? In other words, can we leave the land as a sustainable environment for future generations? The Bible, read by Christians and Jews, includes in Genesis 1, verse 28, the statement attributed to the Creator, "Fill the earth and subdue it." Now, surely this scripture text was never intended to justify depriving millions of people of their source of food in order to take control of the land where they were living, so that migrants who left their homelands might occupy and own the fertile soil of what we now call Iowa. Nor does Genesis 1:28 justify the ownership and control of Iowa land today by a handful of corporations known by many as Big Ag, which uses its wealth and influence politically to capture the major benefits of the U.S. Farm Bill that were intended to ensure small farmers against the risks of crop failure due to adverse weather. Today, Big Ag not only owns farmland, but also equipment, seeds, pesticides and fertilizers, animals in CAFOs, slaughterhouses, and food processing plants. Big Ag takes the bulk of the profit from farming and ensures that small farmers earn only a sliver of profit from their farming labor. I mention the Farm Bill because as soon as Congress reconvenes, Farm Bill for the future in the next 5 years will be a prominent issue. And for Iowa, this is a crucial aspect of what happens in the environment. As Congress debates a new 5-year Farm Bill, Big Ag is resisting more funding for small farmers who are eager to invest in regenerative farming that is sustainable. And now, Ren, if you would put up the first slide, which shows the United States chart. The Iowa Farm Union, the Iowa Alliance for Responsible Agriculture, and Farm Action urge Congress to use the Farm Bill to support farming practices that are sustainable, like those endorsed and used by practical farmers of Iowa. Here in this second chart, you see Iowa sits right in the middle of the largest concentration of factory farming, animal livestock farming in the United States. And that affects the land in every way and our health at all levels of life in the land. What might motivate us to face this fact and to try to do something practical and creative about it? I'm sure that not only this chart or simply facts about it will be sufficient to motivate us. Something has to touch the heart. Something has to help us feel that the land deserves our care in a way that allows the ecosystems to flourish, all of the life together, and not simply the profit projections of the most wealthy owners of the agricultural system. I suggest that we have to embrace the ecosystems of the earth where we are, and that's in Iowa, as an awesome gift of grace. And yes, I use the word grace. It is a gift that is undeserved, and that is what the English word grace means. Will we accept the challenge of acting on behalf of this gift and telling elected representatives that we support Iowa's small farmers? Will we support farm policies that regenerate soil fertility to protect the trillions of lives in the soil that make it fertile, as well as the insects, birds, and other animals that enable ecosystems to thrive? Will we ensure biodiverse life in Iowa that is necessary to sustain small farms and humane farming? For I suggest that unless we at least embrace these goals and find practical steps to take to support our Iowa farmers who want to live this life of sustainability, if we do not do that, then we will not be passing on the land to the next generation for their benefit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's time for connection and reflection. Go ahead and turn to a neighbor or jot down some thoughts, feelings, and how you want to respond. I would like to introduce our next panelist, Myron Herzberg. His presentation is entitled A Distant Horizon, Spiritual Leadership and Eco-Anxiety. And be on the lookout for a link in the chat to Myron's handout to accompany his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're so grateful to Tim, Rob, and Iowa Power and Light for giving us this opportunity to think together about climate-informed ministry. I'm going to invite us to focus now a little bit, thinking about how we approach as spiritual leaders our pastoral care of those who have anxieties related to climate change. And my paper begins with a little vignette. They were standing at the end of their driveway, looking anxiously across the horizon for signs of smoke. The radio said the wildfire was 20 miles or so from their town, but the direction was still not sure. Joe slowed down his SUV to a stop and rolled down the window. "I'm going to the Albertsons grocery. Do you want to ride?" he said as if it were just another Wednesday afternoon. "Thanks. No," they said, still focusing on the horizon. "Okay," he smiled. "Have a good one." It seems to me that those of us who are Iowans have our eyes on the horizon a bit more than usual these days. The smoke from bitter county supervisor meetings about CAFOs and carbon pipelines is a whiff of the growing distrust even in our small, closely knit communities. The perennial inability of the Iowa legislature to address water quality while Iowans can't swim in our lakes or rivers is a regular reminder of the powder keg that is the urban and rural antagonism. Reactionary police and sheriff's departments stockpile military weapons in preparations for protests by a generation anxious about its future on the earth. Looking at the national horizon, our filmmakers are documenting the demonization of migrants from Central and South America and making films about civil war. I had the privilege of talking to some local young adults here in Grinnell, millennials and Generation Z, to tell me what causes them anxiety when they think about climate change. I had them write things down on little index cards. Here are some of the things that they wrote down. "It feels like climate change is going to determine what our lives will be like. I feel paralyzed, like it is beyond my control. How can regular people like me have an impact? We are worried about where we should choose to live. Instead of locating for career, should we be looking for places where we aren't going to be threatened by hurricanes or floods or fires? We've been talking about budgeting. If we can't afford insurance for our house, how much money are we going to need to save up to recover from a tornado or a flood? And how can we possibly save that much?" We actually had a conversation whether it was moral to have children when the planet is dying. Our generation feels a lot of political pressure. The decisions being made now will have an impact on our lives for decades. Our political decisions have heavier consequences. Climate change makes me worry about conflict between people who have money and those who don't. I don't want my children to live in a gated community. I feel so guilty what kind of earth we are leaving our children. I think if we invite the people in our churches, synagogues, mosques to speak from their hearts, we will begin to understand the destructive and paralyzing anxiety about the earth that grips our children, our young adults, and our elders. Although it is not immediately apparent, careful observers understand that much of the distrust, the suffering, the tolerance of violence, all has its source in an eco-anxiety. The threat to our land, water, air is an existential assault that Iowans feel today. They know it deep down, and they're having a hard time articulating it and aren't given a lot of opportunity to speak about it. Many of my neighbors are really anxious about grocery shopping. Who knew that we would be standing in front of the shelves trying to decide if we could afford a dozen eggs this week? We rail against the grocery industry or some far-off policy set by the USDA. But again, careful observer will see a connection between the spread of avian virus among bird populations stressed by heat. More virus, fewer hens, supply cannot meet demand, and the price of eggs becomes a burden. I think Iowans' very real daily anxieties are often eco-anxieties, if we will take the time to see it. Spiritual leaders have the opportunity to connect the dots. We are still trusted by our communities. We are sought after in moments of distress. We have the confidence of our members, and we have regular access to a cross-section of the community that few people enjoy. We can give our communities framing words and hope-filled narratives for their anxieties. Weekly worship gives us an opportunity to connect the dots. I heard that in Diana's words to us this afternoon. Our weekly gatherings can be intentional events of lament, truth-speaking, and expressions of our common humanity. Words matter. Instead of general references to preserving the creation, we can voice a lament with the laborers who had to destroy a flock of chickens outside of Charles City this week. We can express gratitude for the scientists at the Animal Disease Lab in Ames who are researching the connection between heat and the avian virus. We can anoint or lay hands upon those Iowans who are elected to county, city, and state offices on November 5th, specifically invoking wisdom for the restoration of the earth. Karl Barth famously admonished Christian preachers to prepare their sermons with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in another. When our sermons, our liturgies, our prayers name the Iowa particulars, we teach that our faith has real-world implications. Recent social science research confirms that our faith communities, something that we have known for millennia. Gratitude heals anxiety. Forming habits of gratitude as individuals, households, and congregations will lift our eyes to the mercies and mystery of an ecosystem that sustains us. We are held by brother sun and sister moon. Gratitude fosters the symbiosis that sustains and heals humankind and the good earth. Each of our traditions undoubtedly has rich resources of scripture, poetry, song, prayer, and meditation that fills souls with gratitude, and thus creates souls that have less room to harbor anxiety. I think that spiritual leaders can help faith communities develop habits of curiosity, listening, having difficult conversations, and patience seeking consensus. We will profit from spiritual leaders who will leverage the latest disagreement or turmoil in the church or synagogue or mosque into a teachable moment. We can teach skills of engagement that doesn't give up on people who see things differently. Learning how to come to consensus, our communities will rediscover the rich rewards of united action. Further, spiritual leaders often have the capacity to bring people together across economic, social, and partisan divides. We have connections to expertise in universities, in industry, or seminaries, other advocacy groups. Like the switchboard operator of old, we plug the farmer into the expertise of the practical farmers of Iowa. We can plug the landowner into the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. We can plug the elected leader of the town or city or state with the nonpartisan research group. We can plug the neighborhood associations of Black and Latina households who disproportionately suffer the ills of climate change with like-minded groups across the divides of race and class. We can plug the congregation with theologians and vision casters from within and outside of our own faith tradition. You know, a key therapy for anxiety is defining the threat and building skills to respond to it. Spiritual leaders help their congregants objectively name the threat and then plug the community into just such skill-building resources. Well, remember SUV Joe at the end of the driveway? It turns out that he was on his way to Albertson's grocery to transport food to an evacuation center in a nearby town. That brief encounter at the end of the driveway had a curious impact upon his neighbors in two ways. His non-anxious presence, his smile, lowered the temperature of their anxiety. His focus on what would be useful at that moment in that situation inspired in them realism and a reason for hope. Joe lifted the eyes of his neighbors from the near horizon to that future horizon, the Tikkun Olam, the nations gathered at the river of life, the beloved community, the dwelling of the divine. So I'm especially addressing the spiritual leaders who are here this afternoon. You are the non-anxious presence. You are the sleeved, rolled up realists. You are the gifted messengers of a divine hope. For at least 4,000 years, humankind has reserved a place for a few individuals in each society to be set apart. We ordain them to live on the edges of the community as keepers of wisdom who are charged with focusing on the horizon. Well, many of us are just such privileged people, and it's a humbling place to be. We are entrusted with the responsibility of observation, insight, formative ritual, and faithful action. We have the privilege of pointing to that more distant horizon where the divine desire for harmony joins with the restored earth, and the divine desire will be fulfilled. So I conclude by thanking you. Thank you for taking your time this afternoon to think about these important matters. Thank you for responding to the eco-anxiety in your own community. May you embrace this work with confidence and peace.
Thank you so much, Myron. It's time for connection and reflection. Chat with your neighbor, jot down some thoughts, feelings, and something you want to do in response. We are getting a little short on time, so with that, I will pass it to our final panelist for today, Vanessa Burnett, and her presentation, Big Disaster Risks and What Churches Can Do About Them Locally. Vanessa. You're muted, Vanessa. There you go.
There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Vanessa Burnett. I'm based in Iowa in Ames. I'm currently in Oklahoma traveling for some family stuff. So I appreciate being able to join in remotely. So I'm going to talk about big disaster risks and what churches can do locally. So the great timing to follow Myron, I believe. Yes. And because people do have anxiety, there are lots of things that we can do about it. I think sometimes we think about climate ethereally and as this faraway thing, but one of the ways it's manifesting is in more frequent, more intense disasters. And we see that all the time. We see it this week and what's happening in the Southeast with Helene, the hurricane that struck many areas of the Southeast. And if you haven't heard, there's another hurricane called Milton heading for Florida right now. Probably get there like Tuesday, Wednesday. So, but it's not just the Southeast that gets hit. For example, I've tried to insure a new car this year in Iowa, and 3 insurance companies have left Iowa because there's been so much hail damage the last few years. So, and we had the derecho, we had the town of Greenfield just got very heavily damaged this year. So and churches were very involved in that. So there's lots of things where this is manifesting. So I'm going to talk about the disaster aspect of this and how churches can be ready for some of those parts. So this is climate change. We're going to see unprecedented, unimaginable. Those are the words we've been hearing this week about what's been going on in the Southeast. We're seeing damage and weather in places that it wasn't expected before. I've been talking with people in Oklahoma this week. They're talking about how they used to get the more severe tornadoes, but now they're like moving up more to Kansas. I don't know if that's true, but that reflects what people are seeing in the places that we live. So things that we thought were safe before are maybe not safe. We have tornadoes now in Iowa in December. We have massive floods in December. It's supposed to snow in December. So we need to be more ready for the unexpected in the places where we live. And it might not be just disasters. It might be active shooters. It might be cyber attacks, lots of things. For my background, I worked at Homeland Security for a long time. So I have all kinds of worst case scenarios. Anyway, the thing is, this planet is getting more intense. So we need to be more ready in the places we live with our people and communities. This means our congregations too, and our churches, any kinds of groups. So there's lots we can do. Let's see. So we're going to use tools. What I'm going to talk about are tools or some frameworks from big disaster management. You don't have to be intimidated. It's basically principles and concepts. So it's a field called incident management, disaster management, or emergency management. They're all like slightly different, but basically the same thing. So that's my background and experience. It's a framework that churches can use. Any groups can use what I'm going to be talking about here. I've tweaked it, to just talk about how churches and congregations can use it. You can use these basics for short-term planning and long-term planning. So, and I'm going to go over how to do that. You can start by anchoring what you would like to do about climate in your local church by anchoring it in your values and your goals and your priorities. So what do we want to do? I grew up in a Lutheran church in Nevada, Iowa. So, we might be looking at well, I won't give hypothetical examples. Anyway, consider your priorities, consider your values. Where do you want to start? So kind of start there. Do we want to be more resilient? What does resilience mean? Resilience means that you can bounce back, you can take a hit and be able to come back. The reality is, like, the security, we can't be secure from everything. We're going to have things happen. Resilience is, okay, recognizing that things are going to happen. How fast can we recover, or how effectively can we recover? Do we have reserves? Do we have capacity? Do we have resources? So resilience is very complicated, but it's how do we come back after a hit, after an incident, after an emergency? So do we want to be more resilient? Do we want to take care of more people? Do we want to do more service to our community, or with our community, or with our members, or with whoever, with our partners? Do we want more engagement? Do we want to be better ready for certain things? So those are questions about priorities. And with those would go goals and objectives. What are our specific goals? But what I would suggest is keep those in mind, and then we'll come back to that after I kind of go through this process. So the next thing is find a team or set up a committee, get a couple of people together, decide that you want to do something. Okay, we want to deal with climate in our church. Let's find a few other people. Let's get started. Have a team, have an initiative, a group, a committee, do a series, have conversations, and then make commitments. Ask people to commit, to get involved in this work, because this is coming and there are things we can do right here where we live. So the planning process that I'm going to talk through involves three things: situation, resources, and risk. And this is the basics of like doing big disaster management. You always come back to these things. And like, for example, I liked that we had a wildfire story in the prior speaker. I'm from Wildfire originally, and we would call this situation, like situational awareness. So you start with the situation, resources, or resource status, or what are the resources that we have, and then risk. In wildfire, risk would be like fire danger. Like, is it extreme fire danger? Like, for example, today, right now in Iowa, there is elevated fire danger, which is because it's fire season in Iowa in the fall. So that's a risk, right? But there's lots of different kinds of risks. Are we at an increased risk for floods, that sort of thing. So assess the current situation, situational awareness, have situational awareness. What's happening in our community? What have been the issues in our community? Where is it happening? How does this affect our church, our congregation? Be realistic, be honest. One of the problems with disasters is we assume things, or this is getting handled, or, well, that looks kind of funky over there, but I'm sure it's fine. Like, you drive, for example, in the wildfire world, you drive up a canyon and everything is made of wood, and there's like all the houses are made of wood, and there's trees over everything, and there's grass along the ground. And, I just drive up there and go, seriously? Like, how is this not going to burn down? And then, eventually it burns down because it's dangerous. So assessing the current situation is important. So just look around your community. You can talk to the emergency management people. There's lots of resources. You can assess. Now, the number 2 is to assess the resources. Who do you have that you can work with in your congregation, in your church? Are there existing teams or initiatives? Can you create some? Who are the members that are interested? How do you reach members? How do you recruit people? But also, what's our budget? Can we get more money? Do we have ways to bring in more money? What are our partnerships? What churches or other groups do we regularly work with that we could do more with climate? Our facilities, vehicles, equipment, kitchens. Kitchens can be relevant in a disaster. Lots of churches serve meals and things. Facilities for shelter. Sometimes churches serve as incident command posts for teams that come in. Supplies. There are lots of churches that are involved in disaster response elsewhere. And so they're very good at that, but like, do we do things locally? Okay, so that's resources. Assess risk and risk potential. That can be consequences that could happen, threats that are out there, vulnerabilities that you have. A vulnerability would be like, well, I live in a floodplain, or our church is in a floodplain. Or a threat would be, like a hurricane is coming to Florida right now this week. That's a threat. And then potential consequences, like if the hurricane hits Florida and people are already flooded out and their houses are already damaged, like, how is this all going to work? How are they going to get the state evacuated? And so consequences are a big deal. Anyway, that's all part of risk. So you can look at the history of where you live, imagine worst case scenarios, talk to emergency managers, look at the science, have conversations, talk to people who've been around for a while. People forget things that happened 20, 30 years ago. New people have moved in. Be willing to see and talk about things that people tend to take for granted or assume will be handled. Oh, I'm sure someone's got that. Well, usually in a disaster, one thing that happens in a disaster is everyone assumes something's handled and it's not. And then next thing you know, it's damaged or gone or not working. So then you put all this together, you make a plan to make a plan, right? So this is where you kind of want to get all the pieces, put it together, think about what you want to do short term, what you want to do long term, or if you just want to focus on one or the other, get your team or your committee or your initiative, have a series or have workshops or whatever, and then get started, then make a plan. So again, go back over the situation, look at the resources that you have or what you could get, and then look at the risk. So you can start by going, hey, what's easy? What's the low-hanging fruit? What can we do quickly to help us be more ready? Or what's the most urgent? Like, what does our congregation probably need the most right now to deal with climate, to help us be more resilient or whatever? Here are some examples that I just wrote down. Are there vulnerable low income communities in a floodplain? Do you have bird flu worries about supply chain interruptions? If you're not tracking bird flu, it's a thing that's happening, and that's a whole other call, but it's out there. It could eventually spread to humans and we could have another pandemic. It's a very serious thing. If that happens, we're gonna have lots of issues, not just supply chain, but so talking about bird flu and really being honest about that, that's a risk. And it does relate to climate change, as other speakers have mentioned. We're going to have more pandemics and more disease as climate change unfolds. So these things are important. Are there people in a place where a fast evacuation might be needed and your church can help with that? Can you get involved in some of the planning that the emergency managers are already doing? Do you have emergency managers? I live in a town that doesn't have a full-time emergency manager, and we're in a town of 60,000, 30,000 because we've got a university, but we don't have a full-time emergency manager. So there's a lot of gaps and a lot of places don't have one. So nonprofits and churches fill in the gaps. Another example is that your congressional demographics might have certain vulnerabilities. So anyway, okay, I'm trying to wrap it up. So again, what are your values, priorities, and goals? Add this to what's easy and urgent to start with, and that can help you actually make a plan. Then make the plan. Whether, pick a thing. Don't do all the things. Don't do like a comprehensive, because what people do is they get bogged down and they make like a 5-year climate plan, and then by the time it's done, it's not relevant. Start with something simple, pick one thing or pick 2 things, and then start going after it. Have weekly or monthly meetings, actually act on it, execute the plan, and then iterate. Go around in a circle. So every time you iterate or you update the plan or you decide to take on something new, go back over that situation. What's happening? What are the resources that we have? What's the risk? And then what are our values, priorities, and goals? And are those things changing given what we've learned and what's happening? So that's basically the stuff. I have some ideas that I could run through just for what to do, but I know we're tight on time. So if you guys want to hear the ideas, I'll do those. Otherwise, I'll do my takeaways really quick. Make teams, get connections, get going. Like community and conversations and connections are going to be really important here. Figure out your values, priorities, and goals. Commit to act, make agreements, whatever you need to do. Do an assessment of the situation, the resources, and the risk. Plan to plan, actually plan, execute the plan, and then update it. Update the plan, revisit all the stuff, and iterate. And I would end by saying, keep the faith, encourage each other, and we find strength when we do things and do them together. There's a lot of climate anxiety out there and eco anxiety. We can we can navigate that. It's get throughable. Humans will survive. So how do we get through that effectively and with the least trouble and damage and hurt and pain? So this is a place to start. Okay, thank you. And I'll do questions whenever we get to that.
While that's getting figured out, I did want to note that both Tim and Vanessa shared H5N1, also known as avian flu and bird flu resources in the chat. If y'all want to check those out, please feel free to do so. And check out Tim's prompt.
Can I jump in on Tim's prompt?
Yes,
This is
please.
directed at the speakers, not necessarily at listening and present community members. So I'll just say that there's a lot of hope, and I'm so glad that all of you touched on the sources of strength that each of your communities and your churches and your activities, your professions can provide. It gives me hope that so many, talking about mental health, there's so many resources, and it gives me hope that as our children are affected by the fear for their future, and 80% of youth aged 16 to 25 feel that we have failed to take care of the planet. That's a lot of people. 75% feel afraid for their future. At the same time, they step up and they're very happy. I like what Myron said about giving resources and to young people, and to be the source of connection building. I think all of that we can give as hands-on tools to our young, because they are our best resources at the same time. My way of thinking is probably not nearly as diverse and swift, and has access to technological, and that includes communication resources, as young people. And it's exciting to see how many young people are choosing professions that seek to find solutions, and we can encourage them in that. That gives me a lot of hope. It gives me hope that there are more and more resources. For example, all of you who have spoken today are a resource. At Moms Clean Air Force, we're a resource. I mean, just if you go to momscleanairforce.org, all in one word, you find all these fact sheets in English and Spanish about anything having to do with all the things we talked about, and so much more. Short 2 pages that will bring to the common person who maybe hasn't even taken a science course in his or her life, explanations that bring it down, so all of us can act as resources. That's a huge source of hope for me. And then the conversation, Vanessa talking about creating, seeing what resources are available, creating a plan. We can bring it down to the family level. Organizations like mine and resources like yours in your church, in your professions, not just at the community level, but at the family level. We can start supporting conversations about what do we do when the next disaster hits? Do we have a plan? How do we communicate? That sort of thing. And if things get really, really bad, there are more and more climate aware therapists. So it's important to match someone who really is overwhelmed by eco-anxiety with a therapist that understands and is trained in it. And there are more and more like that all the time. So that makes me very hopeful. And I'll finish by saying, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. If you're willing to sign one of our, I don't know, 3 times a month petitions, one thing, I came into my organization feeling that petitions were maybe a waste of time, but actually they're not, because I see what we do with them, and I don't know how it works for all of you. But I explained to my on-the-ground people, look, don't be discouraged by the fact that only 2% of plastics are recycled. recycling still has a good thing. And then that leads to a conversation about the next step. And the next step of can do. And can do is important. Joy is important. And I tell them these petitions actually make a difference because we, our organization anyhow, we collect them, we put them together, and then as a group, they have weight. So if we can walk up to the EPA and say, look, we just collected 18,000 signatures on this issue and we make sure it gets delivered, it's the strength in all of us coming together that gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Karin. Anybody else want to share what gives them hope?
I'll share something that hasn't been mentioned yet today. Something that gives me hope is just the resilience of nature, of creation, and how I love examples like after a forest fire, for example, how or a prairie burn, how the green reemerges so quickly and the amazing resilience that we can see. And coupled with that, there is a movement, I'm not sure how many of you may have heard of the Wild Church movement, which is a movement of worshiping outdoors and just really helping people to pay attention to creation, both to the groaning and that resilience that is present, and I think so powerful, and that we underestimate that we as humans can partner with creation in healing, and that wild church element is helping people reconnect with the power of creation, the kind of that spiritual connection that really is so important in motivating action. So that gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Karla. Vanessa, did you have something?
Sure. I have hope in kind of a strange place. What's happening in the Southeast is so tragic and so huge, disaster-wise. But the hope that I have is I see people taking care of each other. And, that's not always what's happening there in this emergency, but people are finding ways to create systems locally when everything else is out, when the infrastructure is out, when there's no communications. There are people who are going around making sure that their neighbors have food and water when it has been dire. And so it's the human spirit and how humans feel compelled to take care of each other. And we're seeing it again in this very great, spectacular catastrophe, and with more to come. And, we're not out of the woods. The media isn't really covering it, but the word is getting out and people are taking care of each other. And I think that spirit is what we can build on, and that's where I find hope.
Thank you so much, Vanessa.
I'll add one more piece to this. Karin and Karla and Vanessa have said it so well. I often come back to Mr. Rogers. Look for the helpers. That's one of the pieces for me. I grew up on Mr. Rogers, so there we are. And there's a second piece, though, that I really come back to in work on climate, and that is that hope is not the same as optimism. I think all of us sitting here know that climate change is here. We're not going to ever go back to climate the way it was 40 years ago, not for a long, long time. The systems that are in place, the feedback loops that we have are such that that's not an option. We have irreversible climate change that is happening, and that is it. There is still stuff we can do, though. Hope is not the same as optimism. Hope, rather, for me, is about knowing that something is worth doing and committing myself to it. Hope is that knowledge that, yes, there is still something we can do. We can't do that one thing, but there are still so many things that we can do. There are so many better outcomes that we can have. And there are worse outcomes we can have. And it's worth committing my life and helping my congregation commit our collective lives to making some of those better outcomes. So
Can I add
that's mine.
something to what? Can I add something to what you just,
Please.
to what Diana just said? That hope includes our self-awareness. So in other words, each one of us can keep having the antennae going, saying, okay, what else can we do? What else needs to be done? So for example, are our doctors aware that certain medications make exposure to heat worse and more dangerous? Do our doctors even know that? We can reach out to our hospitals to make sure our medical communities are aware of this. Do we, are our local psychologists aware that some people, some cultures deal with dangers differently? Are we covering language barriers for the immediate needs? And are we talking to our local already fantastic resources like our counselors to ask them, are you trained in trauma specifically, in response to trauma? So what gives me hope is that all of us are privileged to have the tools to recognize that we can always do a little more.
That's beautiful. Thank you all. Tim, do we have time for another question? Okay, great. So religious organizations have so many concerns and many are in decline. How might climate-informed ministry help to revitalize congregations?
Well, I'll just jump. Okay. No, Vanessa, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, no, you could go for it.
Okay. I just kind of, well, as the active congregational minister here, although anyway, everybody's coming from our own perspectives, Karla, in a way you are, and Myron, anyway. So my congregation is actually vibrant and growing at this point coming out of the pandemic. And I know that our justice work and our work on celebration and connecting with the earth and connecting with the land as part of our religious education programming, that all of those things are a lot of the reason why we are vibrant and growing. Now, I know we also have some really special circumstances here. There are circumstances around our geographic location and those kinds of things. And I think sometimes staying stuck or not moving into some of these. So I want to be clear. I do know that moving into justice work is really hard for a lot of congregations. And believe me, as a justice-minded minister, I know that it is not easy work. And for me, it's very life-giving. It's also very challenging, and I have to have lots of resources for myself around that. But for us, it's led to a growing congregation. And Unitarian Universalism is actually staying steady or declining at lower rates than a lot of other denominations, in part for many of these reasons, because we have been very invested in climate justice work, environmental climate justice, but also other justice issues. And that makes a difference. It draws people to us. Vanessa, you were starting to jump.
Yeah, and I typed a little bit in the chat. I would just add to that and say that doing climate, I had this list of ideas I was going to talk about, but it's things like having a potluck problem solving thing, having a climate conversation. It's a way to help bring people together and have a focus that addresses things that people are actively worried about and impacts that are happening now. So that kind of engagement, I think, can help pull people together with more common purpose than, I don't know. I mean, yes, we should and can all pull together for spiritual and religious and all of those things. But part of that is taking care of humans and taking care of people. And there's a lot of opportunity here to do work that can help us take care of each other in a time of climate change. And so the lots of different options that we have to do that can help us, I think, re-engage congregations and lots of other groups too.
I like to think about this from the perspective of healthy organisms, healthy cells. Healthy cells have permeable boundaries, right? They let things in, they take things out. That those permeable boundaries make such a difference whether a cell is healthy or not. And that's true for congregations. When congregations are involved in their communities, they become healthier. And that exchange is so significant because it is actually health being developed in both directions.
Are there any other thoughts or any other questions that have come up at all? Robert, you're on mute.
I would just say something about what I found hopeful among farmers, and that's the practical farmers of Iowa. I find their programs, their videos online, their magazine, it's just uplifting to see their efforts to show how regenerative farming can be expanded in this state. And it's a total uphill struggle. I'm certainly well aware of that. But the reason I also focus on the Farm Bill is because the Farm Bill shapes farming in Iowa and shapes the use of the land. And until the incentives in the Farm Bill are shifted politically from the monocultures and the livestock operations, really, it's very hard to have practical farming succeed in a sustainable way. So whenever we think about Iowa, we have to start thinking about the land. It's got to recover in a way that's more sustainable for life to improve in the future. And practical farmers are doing their best. I think it's wonderful. So you can always give money to practical farmers. I mean, they put it to good use. That's my experience.
Yes, donate to Practical Farmers. Also, if you feel inclined, donate to Iowa IPL. I'll be dropping our donation link in the chat, but please share it far and wide. We are getting ready for our year-end campaign, and that is very exciting stuff. I will go ahead and drop that link in the chat. And with that, I will pass it to Tim for a closing reflection.
For a closing, I just want to share a little blessing that comes from a wonderful book that I often use called Earth Prayers from Around the World. And this is a prayer from the Ute community. Earth, teach me stillness as the grasses are stilled with light. Earth, teach me suffering as old stones suffer with memory. Earth, teach me humility as blossoms are humble with beginning. Earth, teach me caring as the mother who secures her young. Earth, teach me courage as the tree which stands all alone. Earth, teach me limitation as the ant which crawls on the ground. Earth, teach me freedom as the eagle which soars in the sky. Earth, teach me resignation as the leaves which die in the fall. Earth, teach me regeneration as the seed which rises in the spring. Earth, teach me to forget myself as melted snow forgets its life. Earth, teach me to remember kindness as dry fields weep with rain. May it be so, and thank you so much for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you.